The Black Janitor noticed the symptoms that no one else saw and saved the life of a millionaire CEO. The executive elevator at the Manhattan Business Tower had never stopped on the 25th floor at 3 o'clock in the morning. Not once in James Washington's 15 years as a night janitor. He was a ghost in the gleaming corridors, a silent observer of the corporate world after its inhabitants had gone to sleep. His world was one of buffed floors and empty cubicles. Their world was filled with power, money, and grand mahogany tables that cost more than his annual salary. Tonight, however, their worlds collided. Through the tinted glass of the boardroom, James saw something that made him stop cold. Victoria Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Industries and one of the most powerful women in the country, collapsed. Her face was a mask of pain. Her left arm hung limply at her side, and the words she was desperately trying to get out on her phone were slurred and incomprehensible. A familiar chill ran down James's spine. He recognized the signs immediately. It was a stroke. At 52, James had learned medicine the hard way. His wife, Dorothy, had been a nurse specializing in neurology for 20 years before she died in a car accident 5 years ago. Their life together was a perpetual lesson in emergency medicine. Over dinner, she would quiz him on symptoms and treatments, always insisting that medical knowledge was a universal tool that saved lives, regardless of a person's social status, skin color, or financial bracket. Her favorite saying was, "Neurological symptoms don't respect social class or skin color, Jamie." He'd never thought those lessons would be tested. He hesitated for a second. The protocol was simple. Stay invisible. He was the janitor. He didn't interrupt. He didn't intrude. And he certainly didn't enter the sacred space of the boardroom uninvited. Victoria Sterling was the woman whose face graced business magazines, who moved billions with a simple email. Their worlds were parallel lines that were never meant to cross. Yet, as he watched her struggle, Dorothy's words echoed in his mind. He opened the conference room door, the heavy mahogany swinging silently on its hinges. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the chaotic room. "You're having a stroke. Don't try to talk. Just listen to me." Victoria tried to protest, her face a mixture of fear and confusion, but the words came out even more garbled than before. Panic began to take hold in her eyes as the full, terrifying reality of her condition set in. James was already dialing 911, his movements precise and purposeful. "Ambulance to the Manhattan Tower, 25th floor," he said into the phone, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had watched his wife guide families through medical crises for 2 decades. Female patient, mid-40s, presenting with classic stroke symptoms. Facial paralysis, weakness in the left arm, slurred speech. Symptoms began approximately 5 minutes ago. The 911 operator was audibly surprised by the medical accuracy of someone who identified himself as a janitor. James continued to provide a clinical blow-by-blow with the ease of a healthcare professional. When the paramedics arrived, they found Victoria stabilized, lying in the correct position to prevent further neurological damage, with James providing a detailed account of her symptoms and their progression. "This guy knows more about neurology than half the nurses I know," one paramedic whispered to his colleague, completely unaware that he had just paid a quiet tribute to a woman named Dorothy. At the hospital, while Victoria received the treatment that would save her life, James returned to work as if nothing had happened. He was just the night janitor, the invisible man who kept the building running while the powerful slept in their mansions. He had no idea that this single act would change his life in ways even Dorothy couldn't have predicted. And what Victoria Sterling would discover about prejudice, medicine, and the true definition of competence would rewrite everything she thought she knew about human value. The next morning, James arrived at work expecting life to return to normal. But as he opened his locker, he found an unpleasant surprise. A formal warning note taped to the inside of the door. Inappropriate use of the executive elevator during work hours. Unauthorized access to corporate facilities after hours. The signature belonged to Wilson Carter, the security manager and the kind of man who measured his own worth by his power to make other people's lives miserable. James folded the paper calmly. 15 years of impeccable work, never a complaint, and now he was being punished for saving the CEO's life. The irony was not lost on him. In the corporate world, even doing the right thing could be turned into a crime when you were the wrong man doing it. What really bothered James wasn't the warning itself, but the timing. How had Carter found out about the previous night's events so quickly? The hospital maintained medical confidentiality, and the paramedics had no reason to report details to the company. Someone was watching Victoria Sterling's movements very closely. As he went about his morning shift, James discreetly observed the activity on the 25th floor. Dr. Patterson, Victoria's personal physician, arrived 2 hours later than usual, his face a mix of irritation and what looked like genuine panic. Through the glass doors of Carter's office, James saw a heated discussion between the doctor and the security manager. Dorothy's memory came back to him like a blow to the chest. "Jammy," she used to say when they reviewed complex cases over dinner. When neurological symptoms appear suddenly in stressed executives, the first question should never be, "Why now?" but rather, "Who benefits if this person can no longer work?" James had assumed that Victoria's stroke was the result of stress and corporate pressure. But the tense conversation between Carter and Dr. Patterson planted a seed of doubt that Dorothy would have recognized immediately. Competent doctors don't panic when patients survive medical emergencies. They celebrate. That afternoon, James received an unexpected call. Victoria Sterling wanted to see him in her office. When he arrived on the 25th floor, he found the CEO looking much better, but with an inquiring look that had not been present the night before. "James, correct?" she asked, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from her desk. "I want to thank you personally for what you did last night. The doctor said your quick action saved my life." "I only did what any decent person would do, Miss Sterling," James replied, his voice even. Victoria studied his face with growing interest. "The paramedics were impressed with your medical knowledge. Where did you learn about neurological symptoms?" James hesitated. Talking about Dorothy always hurt, but there was something in Victoria's expression that suggested the question wasn't just polite curiosity. "My wife was a nurse specializing in neurology. 20 years at Chicago General Hospital. She taught me how to recognize emergency signs." He paused, the words heavy with memory. She died in an accident 5 years ago." Victoria's expression softened. "I'm so sorry for your loss." She paused, as if weighing her next words carefully. "James, can I ask you a strange question? In your informal medical opinion, did my symptoms yesterday seem natural?" The question caught James off guard. Victoria Sterling, one of the most powerful women in the country, was asking a janitor for his medical opinion on her own condition. Even more intriguing, she was phrasing the question as if she suspected something wasn't right. "With all due respect, Miss Sterling, this is something you should discuss with your personal physician." Her response came too quickly, laden with barely concealed frustration. Dr. Patterson said it was executive stress. He prescribed sedatives and recommended a vacation. James felt a familiar chill. Dorothy always said that competent doctors investigated the causes of strokes in young patients as if their lives depended on it, because they did. Prescribing sedatives to someone who had just had a neurological event was not only inappropriate, it was potentially criminal. Of mental confusion that Dr. Patterson attributed to work pressure. James kept his expression neutral, but internally, Dorothy was screaming alarms. Any competent neurologist would have ordered detailed tests in light of those symptoms. The fact that Dr. Patterson had ignored them meant one of two things: gross medical incompetence or something deliberately sinister. When James left Victoria's office 15 minutes later, Wilson Carter was waiting in the hallway, making a point of being seen observing the meeting. The smile he directed at James contained a thinly veiled threat, as if to say, "We know you're meddling where you shouldn't be." That night, as James cleaned the empty offices, something Dorothy always insisted on echoed in his mind. "Jammy, there are no coincidences in medicine. When strange patterns appear, there's always someone behind them creating those patterns." What if Victoria Sterling hadn't simply had a stress-induced stroke? What if someone was deliberately putting her health at risk? James thought about the warning in his locker, the argument between Carter and Dr. Patterson, the way they both seemed to know too much about events that should have been confidential. For 15 years, James had been the invisible man, the janitor no one noticed. But invisibility, he was beginning to realize, could be the most powerful weapon against people who thought themselves untouchable, especially when those people completely underestimated what a simple man was capable of observing, understanding, and, if necessary, exposing. Over the next 2 weeks, James did something that 15 years of night work had taught him perfectly: being completely invisible while observing everything. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears about Victoria Sterling's situation. Dr. Patterson visited Wilson Carter's office 3 times a week, always carrying a brown medical briefcase that was never allowed to leave the office. During one of these visits, James accidentally left his cleaning cart too close to the half-open door and overheard fragments of a conversation that made his blood run cold. "The tests continue to show progressive cardiovascular deterioration," Dr. Patterson whispered. "But I'm keeping the official reports within normal parameters." "As agreed." "Perfect," Carter replied. "How much longer do you estimate?" "With the medication I'm prescribing disguised as vitamins, I'd say we have another 6 months before the next serious episode. And that will probably be definitive." James had to lean on the cart to keep from staggering. They weren't just neglecting Victoria's health. They were actively poisoning her. Dorothy had always said that the worst kind of medical crime was one committed by someone who had sworn to protect lives. The missing piece of the puzzle came unexpectedly via Marcus Johnson, the air conditioning maintenance technician who worked in the offices during the day. Marcus was 10 years younger than James, an Afghanistan veteran who had learned electronics in the army and now supported 3 children with contract jobs. "Man, you got to see this," Marcus whispered to James during a shift change on a Friday. "I was installing new filters on the 25th floor when I overheard Carter on the phone. He was talking about Sterling Industries stock, something about buying large quantities before leadership changes he knew were coming." James felt the pieces fall into place. Wilson Carter wasn't just an accomplice. He was the architect of the entire conspiracy. If Victoria died or was incapacitated, as a senior security manager and member of the emergency board, Carter would temporarily take over the company's operations. With inside information about the leadership change, he could manipulate the stock market to make millions. "Marcus," James said carefully, "do you still have contacts in the army? People who understand documentation and evidence?" Marcus studied James's face with the keen perception of someone who had served in combat zones. "Depending on what you need, maybe." "Why?" James made a decision that would change everything. Over the next 2 hours, he told Marcus the whole story. Victoria's stroke, the medical conspiracy, Carter's plans, his suspicions of gradual poisoning. Marcus listened quietly, asking precise questions that betrayed his military-trained intelligence. "That's attempted murder combined with large-scale financial fraud," Marcus said finally. "But proving it is going to be tricky. Do you have any hard evidence?" "Not yet," James replied, "but I know where to get it." The plan they devised was risky but elegant in its simplicity. Marcus would use his authorized access to the building systems to discreetly install recording equipment in Carter's and Dr. Patterson's offices. James, with his knowledge of schedules and routines, would coordinate the operation during the weekends when security was minimal. "One thing bothers me," Marcus said as they reviewed the blueprints of the ventilation system. "Why didn't they just fire you after the warning? A guy who saves the CEO's life should be a hero, not someone being hounded." James had thought the same thing. Why fire the hero right after he saves the boss? Better to keep the janitor invisible where they can keep an eye on him. "They think I'm just an ignorant employee who got lucky recognizing the symptoms of a stroke." Carter and Dr. Patterson's arrogance was impressive. During their conversations, which James was able to partially overhear, they spoke openly about him as the lucky janitor who wasn't educated enough to understand what had really happened. They even laughed about how James had gotten himself into something he shouldn't have but was too smart to keep causing trouble. They couldn't have been more wrong. The first test of the plan took place on a Monday night. While James meticulously cleaned the 25th floor, Marcus worked silently in the ventilation ducts, installing microphones and microscopic cameras in the target offices. Marcus's military operation was impressive. In 45 minutes, he had established a surveillance network that a private detective would have taken weeks to set up. "Ready," Marcus said through the discreet communicator they had purchased. "Now we just wait for them to hang themselves with their own words." They didn't have to wait long. The following Wednesday, Carter and Dr. Patterson had a meeting that was recorded in its entirety. The content was even worse than James had imagined. Not only did they confirm Victoria's gradual poisoning, but they discussed in detail how to increase the dosage to speed up the process. "The press will love this story," Carter laughed. "Young, successful CEO tragically killed by executive stress. It will cause a national uproar about mental health in the corporate environment. A perfect smokescreen for the leadership transition." James listened to the recording 3 times, each playback increasing his determination. Dorothy always said that knowledge without action was complicity. It was time to act. What Carter and Dr. Patterson didn't know was that his words had just signed his own death warrant. And the ignorant janitor they had underestimated was about to prove that true intelligence didn't come from degrees or social status, but from a combination of knowledge, determination, and the most dangerous weapon of all, the absolute certainty of being on the right side of justice. As he meticulously organized the evidence that would destroy them both, James smiled for the first time in weeks. Dorothy would be proud. Not only had he saved a life, but he was about to expose a conspiracy that would shock the corporate world. The medicine she had taught him was being used not only to heal but to deliver justice in a way no court could ignore. The following Wednesday would be remembered as the day arrogance met its final price. James arrived at work carrying something Carter and Dr. Patterson would never suspect: 3 flash drives containing 92 hours of recordings, 15 scanned fake medical documents, and financial evidence that a former military accountant had methodically compiled. Marcus had done more than install surveillance equipment. His army contacts included financial crime experts who had analyzed Carter's stock buying patterns with the precision of a military intelligence operation. The result was devastating: 341 suspicious transactions, all timed perfectly with Victoria's medical episodes. But James had a plan that went beyond simply handing the evidence over to the authorities. Carter and Dr. Patterson needed to understand that they had underestimated the wrong man in the most humiliating way possible. The first phase began during the monthly Sterling Industries Executive Board meeting. Victoria, still recovering and taking the vitamins prescribed by Dr. Patterson, presided over the table as 15 executives discussed quarterly reports. Carter occupied his usual position to her right, radiating the confidence of someone who believed he held the future in his hands. James entered the conference room with his cleaning cart, as he had done hundreds of times before. But this time, as he discreetly emptied the trash cans, he left a sealed envelope on Victoria's stack of documents. When she opened it, she found a single typed line: "The vitamins you're taking aren't vitamins. Check the bottle. Someone who cares." Victoria's expression changed subtly, but Carter was too busy presenting financial projections to notice. James watched from afar as she surreptitiously examined the bottle of supplements she always carried in her purse. 15 years of being invisible had taught him to read facial expressions with surgical precision. Victoria had just realized that something was fundamentally wrong. The second phase came 2 hours later when Dr. Patterson arrived for his weekly routine consultation with Victoria. He couldn't have known that James had installed a directional microphone in the office lamp, or that Marcus was recording everything from a van parked across the street. "How are your stress symptoms, Victoria?" Dr. Patterson asked with the false solicitude James had learned to despise. "Have you been taking your supplements as directed?" "Religiously," Victoria replied, but her voice carried a note of suspicion that made the doctor shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Actually, doctor, I'm considering a second medical opinion just to make sure we're getting the best treatment possible." James saw a panic flash across Dr. Patterson's face through the microscopic camera Marcus had installed. "That's completely unnecessary, Victoria. Your tests show steady improvement. A second opinion could confuse the treatment." "And how curious," Victoria interrupted, opening a drawer in the desk. "Because I received this today." She produced the envelope James had left along with a bottle of supplements. "Someone suggests that these are not vitamins." What would you say if I sent them for independent laboratory analysis? Dr. Patterson paled visibly. Victoria, you can't take an anonymous note seriously. This is clearly an attempt to sabotage your medical treatment. Some disgruntled employee trying to cause trouble. Then you wouldn't mind if I had them tested? The question was phrased with the precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes corporate negotiations. Well, of course I wouldn't mind, but it's a waste of time and resources. I can assure you that. Victoria raised her hand, silencing him. Dr. Patterson, in 15 years as a CEO, I've learned that when someone tries to dissuade me from checking something, that's exactly when I need to check it. The third phase was executed with military precision. While Dr. Patterson tried to convince Victoria not to test the supplements, Marcus was delivering complete copies of all the evidence to the FBI, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the State Medical Board, and the Chicago Tribune. James had insisted that Victoria know the truth before the story went public. She deserved the dignity of fully understanding how her life had been manipulated before the whole world knew. So on Friday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, James knocked on Victoria's office door carrying a briefcase that would change everything. May I come in, Ms. Sterling? There's something important you need to know. Victoria looked up, immediately recognizing the janitor who had saved her life twice. Of course, James. In fact, I want to thank you again, and I also want to know how you knew about the supplements. James placed the briefcase on the desk with solemn ceremony. Ms. Sterling, what I'm about to show you will shock you. But you need to know before the press publishes the story tomorrow morning. Over the next 45 minutes, James methodically presented each piece of evidence. The recordings of Carter and Dr. Patterson discussing the gradual poisoning, the falsified medical documents, the financial transactions proving that Carter had been manipulating the stock market based on her planned deterioration in health. Victoria listened in growing silence, her expression shifting from surprise to horror and finally to a cold anger that James recognized as the controlled fury of someone accustomed to wielding power. They thought I was just an ignorant janitor, James said when he finished. Someone who had been lucky enough to recognize the symptoms of a stroke, but wasn't educated enough to understand what was really going on. And you figured it all out, Victoria murmured, studying the evidence with the attention she would have devoted to a billion-dollar corporate merger. James, you saved my life 3 times. Twice from medical emergencies and once from a conspiracy. What happened next exceeded even James's expectations for revenge. Victoria Sterling wasn't just a successful CEO. She was a corporate strategist who had built an empire dealing with people who tried to betray her. On Saturday morning, when Carter arrived at the office for an emergency meeting Victoria had called, he found not only her waiting, but also FBI agents, representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and an investigator from the State Medical Board. Wilson, Victoria said with the coldness of someone about to fire an incompetent employee, I'd like to introduce you to some people who are very interested in your extracurricular activities. Carter tried to maintain his composure, but James, watching from afar through the security cameras Marcus had hacked, saw the exact moment when arrogance turned to panic. Victoria, what's going on here? If this is about some ridiculous accusation, Victoria smiled without humor. Wilson, they're not here to hear accusations. They're here to make arrests based on solid evidence of attempted murder, financial fraud, and market manipulation. Special Agent Martinez began reading Carter his rights as he protested his innocence with the desperation of someone who finally realized his game was up. Dr. Patterson was arrested simultaneously at his office, handcuffs being placed on him as he tried to delete files from his computer. The fourth and final phase was the most satisfying. On Monday, the Chicago Tribune published the full story on its front page. Janitor hero exposes plot to murder millionaire CEO. James's narrative, a working-class black man using medical knowledge inherited from his wife to save the life of a white female executive, then exposing a complex corporate conspiracy, captured the national imagination. But the real coup de grace came when Victoria called a press conference in front of dozens of cameras. She not only validated every detail of James's story, but announced his immediate promotion to Director of Corporate Safety and Integrity at Sterling Industries, with a salary of $200,000 a year. James Washington, she said to the cameras, her voice strong and clear, has proven that competence, integrity, and intelligence don't depend on degrees or social status. They depend on character, and he has character in spades. Carter and Dr. Patterson watched the press conference from prison, realizing that they had been defeated, not only legally but publicly humiliated by the ignorant janitor they thought they could manipulate indefinitely. The final irony was perfect. While Carter faced 25 years in prison for attempted murder and financial fraud, and Dr. Patterson lost his medical license and faced 15 years in jail, James was being celebrated nationally as a hero who proved that true intelligence comes from the heart, not social status. Dorothy would have been proud. His medical knowledge had not only saved lives but had exposed corruption that could have destroyed many others. And the man she had loved was finally getting the recognition he had always deserved, proving that sometimes justice not only triumphs, it does so in a spectacularly satisfying fashion. 6 months later, James Washington sat in his new office on the 26th floor of Sterling Industries, with a panoramic view of Chicago and a sign on his door that read, Director of Security and Corporate Integrity. The man who had once been considered nothing more than an invisible janitor now led a team of 15 investigators specializing in detecting corporate fraud. The irony was delicious. The same building where he had pushed cleaning carts for 15 years now welcomed him as an executive with his own desk and a $2 million budget to implement security protocols that other companies were studying as a model. Marcus Johnson, promoted to electronic security coordinator, entered the office carrying reports on the new monitoring system they had developed. "Man, I still can't believe we're here," he said, looking at the glass towers through the window. "Remember when you used to clean these rooms?" "I remember every corner of this building," James smiled, signing approvals for the scholarship program Victoria had created in memory of Dorothy Washington. "The difference is that now I can change things from the inside." The Dorothy Washington program offered full medical scholarships to low-income students with a special focus on neurology and emergency medicine. It had already benefited 120 young people in 2 years, many of them the children of janitors, security guards, and laborers who never dreamed their children could become doctors. Meanwhile, Wilson Carter was serving his 25-year sentence in a federal prison in Illinois, where he quickly discovered that his corporate arrogance impressed no one. His assets had been confiscated to compensate the victims of his stock market manipulations, leaving him dependent on public legal aid, the very same he had despised when he was in a position of power. Dr. Patterson, discredited and permanently stripped of his medical license, worked as a medical equipment salesman, earning a tenth of what he had made as a doctor. His reputation was so ruined that no hospital in the country would hire him, even for administrative duties. The medical community had banded together to ensure that he never again put lives at risk. Victoria Sterling transformed Sterling Industries into a national benchmark for corporate integrity. Under her renewed leadership, the company implemented independent medical protocols for all executives, anonymous reporting systems, and strict anti-discrimination policies. The stock price had tripled in 2 years, proving that ethics and profit could go hand in hand. "James," Victoria said, walking into the office for their weekly meeting, "I just got a call from the White House. They want you to testify before Congress about corporate medical reform." James nodded, accustomed to the national recognition his story had generated. Books had been written about the case, documentaries produced, and medical schools used his story to teach about the importance of clinical observation independent of credentials. The most gratifying thing, however, were the letters. Hundreds of ordinary workers wrote, telling how James's story had inspired them to trust their own knowledge, to speak out against injustice, and to believe that competence did not depend on social position. "You know what Dorothy would say about all this?" James asked, looking at her photo on his desk, now in a silver frame instead of the simple photo holder he had carried around for years. "That medicine saved more than a life," Victoria replied. "It saved the truth." James nodded, thinking about how his inherited knowledge had turned into social justice, then systemic transformation. Carter and Patterson thought they were manipulating an ignorant janitor, but they fatally underestimated the power of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. The lesson that emerged from the story was crystal clear. True intelligence does not come from diplomas hanging on the wall, but from the combination of knowledge, character, and the courage to act when necessary. James had proven that competence does not recognize color, social class, or hierarchical position. It recognizes only the truth. Today, when young workers face discrimination or injustice, many ask themselves, what would James Washington do? The answer is always the same. Observe, learn, document, and act with the surgical precision of someone who understands that the best revenge is the success his oppressors could never imagine. If this story of how knowledge and determination can break down prejudice has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that justice, when done right, not only wins, it transforms the world around it. Thank you.